This isn't just a podcast, it's a movement. The Middle Ground Mike is fighting for truth and unity. Subscribe now or support us today. Links are in the notes. Stand with us. America is at a crossroads. Polling is starting to show 68% of Americans believe our country is headed in the wrong direction. Partisan gridlock, crumbling infrastructure, rising distrust in media. If you want to say that, to me, it's been gone for a long time. You're fueling it. But, here at the Middle Ground Mike, we believe in answers aren't found in the extreme, they're found in the middle. And today we sit down with Nathan Smolenski, a voice and an author who understands the cost of polarization and the need for solutions that move us forward and not to the left or the right. How are you doing today, Nathan?
Doing great. How are you?
Another day in paradise. Give everybody a little bit, I know we had a pretty good pre-interview, but give everybody, tell them who you are and what you're all about.
Sure. So I'm Nate Smolenski. I'm the author of Common Ground from the Ground Up. It's a book on how healthier political dialogue can lead not only to personal growth and our ability to better heal the relationships in our lives that are marred by disagreement, but ultimately real impactful societal change. So I'm excited to share that. Formerly, I was state director of the Florida Forward Party, which is a minor party for those not familiar with it. And I've previously kind of worked in the political innovation / bridge building space, either working or volunteering for about 10 years now. So,
well, I mean, that's
a little
awesome.
My background.
We need more people that are willing to do that, especially the middle ground here, right? And you talk about common ground. It's just, we need more people thinking that way.
Yeah. I would agree, but I think with writing the book and with conceptualizing all of this, there are, in some sense, two audiences that have a very similar problem that I was going after. And one is sort of where we find ourselves, which is politically not clearly to the left or the right, not really interested in falling into this team red, team blue. All right, we have all of our opinions. We're going to band with our team and go rah-rah. And a lot of these people, a lot of us, find ourselves over the years politically homeless, frustrated with our options, not really finding something that resonates with us. And so there is that need to connect, to find our voice, to mark our voice in the conversation. And ultimately, I realized we're not the only ones who are lacking that voice in the greater conversation, because we've gotten so bubbled right now. We've gotten so polarized and so alienated from one another that there is a market need for those on the left and the right to find the language, to find the tools to actually express themselves to those who aren't already agreeing with them.
Yes.
And that's where not only do I hope to position ultimately my book and have that resonate and be useful for people, but that is, I think, one of the fundamental market opportunities, the opportunity for a market correction within this political system that we are in, where the need for breaking out of one's bubble is so great that people may latch on to a more positive movement, not because of some moral obligation or change of great heart, but because it's frustrating to just be yelling and yelling and yelling and not have the needle move at all.
It gives you a headache after a while.
Well, absolutely.
Something that I found, as we kind of talk about common ground, going to what you are, and I know this isn't popular among my friends on the right, but I found that, especially doing through this podcast, the industry I work with a lot of younger people. Gen Z is not as polarized as the media would make them out to be. They're a lot more middle and open to different ideas than I think they're given credit for.
I think part of that, at least anecdotally, I can attest, is seeing so much of this conflict mindset, of this hyper-polarized politics, and being kind of a little bit numb to it and really just so tuned out and turned off by it, because there is an understanding that there's got to be something better than this, right?
Yeah. And I think I think America is going to find that millennials and Gen Z want common ground a lot more than Generation X. And I'm not knocking Generation X at all. You know, they grew up in a different time than we did, right? They grew up during the Cold War where things were a little bit more black and white. You know, now with social media and everything, things are so just gray. I don't even know if there's a black and white anymore at all. It's just one big blob of gray, you know, but through my experiences, kind of like talking about like, you know, to the meaning of your book is, you know, I've talked to a couple people, you know, where I work. I mean, some of them are younger kids. They're like, you know, 17, 18 years old. And I didn't even know someone listened to my podcast. They're like, yeah, boss, you know, I listen to your show and da-da. They're like, man, I love it. And I'm like, you listen to I was like, I was floored. I'm like, I would have never guessed. Like, oh, it just makes so much sense that people don't want to fight and argue. And I'm like sitting there and I told my wife, I said, there might be hope yet. I'm like, I'm finding there's kids out there that, you know, just because they don't like what they hear, you know, if you turn on the media, oh, if I don't like what I hear, screaming, this, that, but the one thing that they all do say is America lacks mental health support. And people go, oh, well, that's something new. That's social. I'm like, no, we had mental institutions for a long time. Now, granted, some of them were pretty bad places, but we need to have something like that for these people to go. You know, they don't have, you know, so right now, all you got are the people that have severe mental issues wandering the streets, and well, we see the results.
Yeah. And I mean, that is a prime example of the modern politics being really inept at solving problems,
Oh, yeah.
actually finding solutions to issues. Especially like they really don't do a lot on non-polarized issues. There's very little incentive to work on anything that doesn't distinguish you from your opponent.
Yeah.
Where
I heard a guy named Scott Jennings. Well, he's on CNN. I don't mind following him sometimes because he's right, but he's, you know, right wing, but sometimes he kind of has a little bit of a balanced answer. Not all the time. Yeah, I guess it was a phrase that I had never heard, right? They call it the 80-20 policies. Policies that 80% of their people or the public can kind of get behind, and then 20% that don't. And that's what a lot of campaigns are based on. You know what I mean? Like 80% of your people, 20% might not, you know, and they blend it a little bit to try to win the electorate and the popular vote. So they're not really going after issues that matter. They're going after issues that they know can get people riled up. Because if you've got an 80-20 rule, that tells you right there, you're only going to go after what's going to get people mad. You know, because it's not about an issue, it's about getting an emotional response.
you know, I think, and I talk about this somewhat in the book, which is, all right, how did our politics start to play to cater to this kind of polarization?
Yes.
And one of the big turning points, and a lot has been gradual, a lot has just developed over time, but 1994 and Newt Gingrich's success in that year was ultimately the poster child of, hey, a lot of my people listen to conservative radio. Let's play to this talk radio crowd. Let's not worry about making stuff that's accessible to Democrats because the Democrats aren't really paying attention. I want my crowd more energized. I want them more emotional, donating better, turning out better, and volunteering more. And the reality is that works. And I don't blame him. I'm someone who tends not to vilify the person who finds the exploit. It's an exploitable system, and it's become much more exploitable with the emergence of social media and the fact that our communications paradigm has become even more siloed,
Oh,
has
yeah.
become even more bubbled off. And now it's just, it wins every election. It wins every time, is work to that emotional, rile up your base, preach to your choir. That is what works. And trying to move politics away from that requires, I think, either a fundamental mindset change or really fundamental structural changes.
Let's take a quick break.
The Middle Ground, Mike, isn't just another podcast. It's a movement for unity, for truth, for a future beyond the left and the right. But movements don't grow without people willing to stand up. Subscribe now on Buzzsprout. Fuel this mission directly on PayPal. Every subscription keeps the fire burning. The links are in the show notes. Be more than a listener, be part of the middle ground. Yeah, it kind of goes to like, when we talk a little bit about polarization and public trust, right? So right now, in terms of World Press Freedom Index, we're ranked 27th out of 180 countries. That's a huge drop compared to 10, 20 years ago. You know, Before I ask the other part of that question, a quick statement that I have is a lot of the public doesn't realize your companies like CNN and all that, they're actually registered entertainment companies. They're not registered news organizations anymore. That being is they can go, well, the pen's blue, but I don't really know if it's blue, pink, purple, white, gray, or pink. Because when you stretch it like that and you're an entertainment company, you don't have to come back and apologize as much unless there's public pressure. Now, to where if you're an official news organization, if you misstate something, blah, 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 you have to issue a redaction, you got to apologize, all those things, right? So that's how they're getting away with commentator politics, per se, in that aspect. My buddy worked for Spotlight. It's kind of like an advertising thing that Comcast owns. I don't know if it's still around or not, and he said, he was like, yeah, because he had to put the ads in and and he goes, yeah, all these companies are entertainment companies, so they don't have to follow the same rules as political ads do. And it was just so telling. And as soon as I learned that, I was like, man, a lot of this makes sense. Cause I'm like, how can you be a news organization and knowingly say something in a certain manner, right? How can that be legal? But in return, to me, that's what pushes the US down to 27th, because then you have governments in response. They start trying to put clamps down on certain things. You must report the truth. Then they start putting guidelines in place. Well, what do those guidelines do? They stamp out freedoms. But that's because the government, for whatever reason, doesn't go, well, let's CNN, you report news. You cannot be an entertainment company. But anyway, I mean, that's here nor there. I just thought it was a interesting tidbit. Why do you think the trust is collapsing from your perspective, in your background? And how can like the federal government, because only 16% of Americans trust anything that the federal government does or says. How can we rebuild the freedom of the press and the trust in the government?
I think to the first part of that, the sort of collapse of institutional trust, I have a hard time saying it's not earned, because our politicians for decades and decades have been catering to, let's rile up the crowd. That works. And this is the cost of that. At the same time, so while that is kind of the outcome that we see, a lot of people look at that very pessimistically and say, oh my God, things are just getting worse and worse and worse and worse. I keep going back to this notion of the market opportunity. When I see, all right, this is the government optimized for today's attention economy, but it does not produce real solutions. This is not just some tragedy. This is the weakness of the approach. Over time, it can win elections, at least when everyone is playing along these rules or just playing to the way we understand politics and the way we've approached electoral politics so far. But it does create this tremendous need for A, trustworthy politicians, and B, real solutions. People do not feel heard. They do not feel bought in. And they've, I think, rightfully felt more and more manipulated over the years, to the point where whatever politicians they may have trusted before are kind of crying wolf now. And the trust has eroded. To heal that, I think you really need a lot of transparency. You need a kind of approach that resonates as understanding the complexities, the realities of issues.
Yes.
Speaking to people on that level. But again, I don't see that as a negative necessarily. I see that as an opportunity for political innovators, for people who have a more thoughtful approach with the right tools, with the right kind of social momentum. I think there is possibility to take that and turn it into our pathway to making change and making something positive out of it.
Yeah, no, and that is key, you know. I like expand on it a little bit, right? So a lot of polls
Right.
say America wants a third party, a viable third party, right? You know, and
Yeah.
I would say what's probably the polls say 60 some odd percent, right? But I probably think it's probably like more like 95%. There's just not all of them that are gonna people want to admit it, but you know, full disclosure, 13 years old, I was a libertarian. You know, I started reading Thomas Sowell, Milton Friedman and stuff. You know, obviously young, didn't really know too much about it. You know, obviously I grew up and moved way further towards the center. Vegetarianism, as much as I like it, to me, it's just kind of like a pie in the sky type of thing because again, it relies on everybody always doing the right thing regardless. And that's just not human nature. As much as I would like it to be, as much as I want to have that complete faith in, you know, my fellow individual human, but it's just not reality, you know, and I think to put it on reality is just you're selling people short, you know.
Yeah.
But, you know, from your perspective and, you know, your book and stuff like that, what does that look like to you? You know, do you see that as a realistic option that we could have?
Yeah. And it's not as simple as yes, because I've worked in the third party space. And I think if you are in a third party, if you are presenting a third party, trying to organize a third party, and all you have is that, look, people are reticent, people are distrustful of new politicians. And you have to be cognizant of why the current politics that both of us and so many Americans don't like, why it works as well as it does. It gets people energized. The people in the middle tend to be quieter. They tend to not be shouting from the rooftops. They tend to not be shouting at all. They tend to avoid political arguments when they can. That may be why you run into fans who you may not have expected because the middle doesn't talk about it as much. So you really need to be cognizant of that and also be cognizant of if you espouse the values that I and so many bridge building, I think, endeavors have talked about, which is curiosity and intellectual openness and intellectual humility, transparency, all of this, that's great. That is not a political platform. And there is a lot more that people need from a third party than just being a third party.
Yes.
I talk in my book, and I've used this in party building, working with candidates, puppies. Puppies are what I like to call the core of how you address demand that is unmet by partisan politics. You need sort of real ideas that are pertinent, that speak to real issues, that are unifying, that have not only the language to access diverse ideological groups, but the viability to work through diverse ideological groups and legislative bodies with different control. You need things that are pragmatic and address the complexities and realities of the issues, that speak to people's intelligence and their ability to realize, oh, the solution is not going to be something super simple. You need things that are positive. You need to have this orientation towards a problem solving mindset, towards actually working somewhere where we resolve a problem rather than yelling about it. You need ideas that are innovative, that capitalize on this sort of trap that both left and right fall into, which is they need to keep repeating. They can't present an unfamiliar idea. They have to keep repeating the same talking points. And new ideas are exciting for people. You
Yes.
need ideas that are empowering, that speak to just people being more heard, more involved, more represented in the policy. And you ultimately need a kind of politics that is self aware, where if you are going to present a third party approach, something off the beaten path, be cognizant of how people will see you and what people will think. Once you address that, I think, because my experience was we did not get people who were fervently opposed to us when I was in the third party space. We got people who would quietly say, good luck with that, and would sort of look at us as pie in the sky idealists. And you need to be able to address that. You need to have that self awareness to deal with that. So, again, that's why I always suggest, and I say it in the book, adopt puppies, which is pertinent, unifying, pragmatic, positive, innovative, empowering, and self aware. I think these are the keys to the kind of new politics that can succeed.
I mean, that's, like that kind of goes into like, some other talking points I had here for you. Economic and social stuff, right? Let's delve a little into that because I think that is very relevant to the things that you're talking about, right? Because like I said before, it's the economy, right? I mean, no matter what kind of social issues are going on, when it boils down to it in America, that dollar just hits every political class, no matter where you're at in life. You can have your passion about something, but if you don't got $5, that passion means nothing. So that's where, that's how our system is kind of built on, right? So inflation has cooled, you know, but the vast majority of how people are still seeing their living paycheck to paycheck. You know, what cultural changes, can we do to kind of, from your perspective, based on your book, address some of this?
Well, my book, I will say, stops short of. I don't want to be the person providing all of the solutions. I
Right, right.
can't be the person providing all of the solutions. But as far as how we talk about and how we think about things, it's ultimately, all right, understanding the realities of the problem at hand, realizing what are the incentives in play? What is going on that is making this policy or this policy not work? Appreciating kind of the toolbox, which is what I like to think about. Right. New ideas, even if they're seemingly opposed to one another, they all add to how we can build solutions. And the example for me, because I worked with Andrew Yang. He, of course, was behind Forward initially as a national movement. It merged with other movements, but I had previously worked for the Legacy Forward Party, which became part of that merged organization. He gained a lot of popularity and a lot of traction for his support of universal basic income. Only about 60% of his supporters were in favor of that trademark issue, which is surprising for a lot of people. And there are different explanations of this that his former staffers will give. A lot of it is around, well, it's not that he necessarily had the right solution, but he was thinking about the right problem. He was showing, okay, he's actually putting thought into this. And I would go one step beyond that, which is to say, even if that is not a perfect solution, and I find it very much an imperfect solution, it's adding to our ability to solve the problem. When you have, say, a universal basic income program, a welfare program, a tax cut, all of these are fundamentally the government funneling money purely into the economy, purely into people's hands to stimulate some sort of economic growth, activity, or opportunity. You can aim for those in the lowest income brackets. You can aim to most benefit those in the highest income brackets, or you can go all across the board, and all of them create different incentives, and all of them have different drawbacks. A welfare program may keep people ultimately trapped in a loop, and it doesn't do so much for job stimulation. It is more creating this safety net. A tax cut doesn't address the safety net and doesn't necessarily hit the people struggling the most very well. But it does, to a degree and to a varying degree that we need to be cognizant of, stimulate some economic activity, some job growth in places. And a UBI program, all right, well, it may have more positive incentives across the board, but it has inflationary effects depending on the scale. So these are all imperfect tools that we need to be cognizant of that we can add to. All of these are parts of how do we address a lack of economic activity? How do we address a particular region, a particular locality? There are people struggling. There's a lack of job growth. How do we deal with that? And these are the tools we have. This is the data we can be looking at. And it's this mindset, this sort of problem solver mindset where someone is saying something different than we are, that can add to our ideas. That can add to the conversation. We don't have to be enemies. We are all working and all contributing to a conversation where we are trying to build the best solutions that work. And that, I think, as a North Star, is really valuable.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a perfect, I mean, I couldn't have said it better, really. I mean, that's a perfect way to see it. kind of going back to that a little bit. So, I believe they may won something $1 trillion in student loan debt off the top of my head, you
Oh God.
know, and, and they're saying, younger voters often feel ignored, right? I mean, they do. I mean, how can these leaders, because Andrew Yang, I mean, definitely very forward thinking individual and pretty nice guy from what I've seen in interviews. How can leaders like him and current leaders, right, that are part of there, like, how can we bridge the generational divides in the policy?
Make people feel heard, make people feel empowered. I think the lack of empowerment is the most fundamental thing that needs to be addressed and the most fundamental opportunity you have as a movement. This is the crux of why I wrote my book and why I present it the way I do is there is a need not only within, the center, not only among the politically independent, but this is something that I really designed. I think the greatest value is if I can make something that those like you or me who find ourselves frustrated immediately by the partisan conflict and the political polarization can pass along to those who are more entrenched in the conflict and say, look, what you are feeling is on some level trapped inside your bubble. You feel helpless to do anything about this political tide, about this constant conflict. The needle's not moving. As much as you can yell at people and fight with people, the needle's not moving. And empowering people to go beyond that and to have an outlook towards ideas and solutions and policy and politics that has some hope in it, I think that is something people are demanding hugely, even if they're not saying it that way.
Yeah, no, I mean, that kind of goes back to, I talked a little about mental health earlier, right?
Yeah.
I think 1 in 5 Americans, are saying they now struggle with mental health issues. To you, and obviously, because you've worked in a third party circle, and you've got a pretty significant background in all this, which is phenomenal. How much of, these mental health struggles are tied to like the politics and the media, fueling all this fear and outrage?
I'm not going to say that our politics is singularly responsible for our mental health crisis, although our current politics is also very bad at solving this mental health crisis. But there are certainly parts of our polarized, hyper-partisan, the various political and media rage machines that do play upon it, that whether they target it or not, look, it's these people who are the loudest on social media. And I've found this actually with family members as well. The people who are the most intense about it, they're really struggling. They're
Yes.
really in need of this politics as an expression. I talk about, and we talked, I think earlier about politics as sport, politics as religion, just the way that our political identities transform and evolve over time. And these are people at the core of that, at the center of that, not our center, but the epicenter of the political noise, who it just becomes their world and it becomes this obsession. And it is deeply unhealthy. They end up also doing the most dangerous things with it, taking it to the worst extremes. But I feel genuinely really sad for these people who are clearly struggling with it, who are clearly, just having this politics where the other side, whatever they perceive as the other side, is so incentivized to say, ha ha, look at what a crazy person you are, rather than to reach out and,
Yeah,
or
I
look
mean,
at what an evil person you are, rather than to reach out. And I feel for that. I really feel for that.
yeah, I mean, and you've worked with, I mean,
Mhm.
several movements. I mean, I think a lot of people in my realm and stuff, and your realm, probably pretty impressed with that.
Mhm.
What are like in terms of everything you've worked with? What are some like real human stories that stick with you that show the cost of partisanship?
I mean, who hasn't had relatives they've fallen out with? Just I had a cousin and a great aunt who was uninvited from a wedding,
Jeez.
from my cousin's wedding for political differences. And I've seen stuff like that. I've seen just arguments get into yelling and shouting and screaming and fighting. And I mean, we've all dealt with that,
Oh yeah.
I think. And I mean, beyond that, I wouldn't say my experience is particularly unique or my insight is particularly special on the relationship harm that it does. I think that's something we're cognizant of. I think what I try to say is, and I talk about this in the book, is my appeal to that is not, hey guys, why can't we all just get along? Politics isn't worth fighting over. Politics is worth fighting over. Politics, these are issues that matter. These are issues that affect a lot of lives. What I think the point is that we need to be making is fighting doesn't actually work. We destroy all these relationships. We have all these heated arguments. That is not the way to actually resolve any problem. That does not lead to any growth. That does not lead to any healing. That does not lead to any societal improvement. And when you position it that way, rather than simply asking people to have civility for the sake of civility, I think you can get to the real core of why people are so frustrated and what it might take for them to consider stepping back and trying to take a breath, so to speak.
Yeah, no, I mean, to me, that,
So the title, I do want to talk about the title for a moment because, it's a repetition. It's kind of cute. A lot of people miss the actual implication, which the from the ground up is speaking to, look, in order for us to break through these barriers in communication that we have, it requires us to sort of rethink what our politics is, rethink what it means to argue about an issue, what it means to disagree. And I talked a little about that, where someone who thinks differently from you, they're also adding to us working towards finding a solution. You can work together towards a solution. The conflict mentality that we assume is just what politics has to be, especially when you step away from that media landscape, you step away from electoral politics, which is competitive. When you're having a discussion with a friend or relative, you can learn from them. You can approach it not trying to win. And not only is it healthier, not only is it more enjoyable, it's also more productive. I talk about the golden rule in the book. I talk about sort of the reciprocity that is one of the most universal moral underpinnings and just underpinnings of how we approach each other and react to each other. If you want people to open their mind to what you have to say, one of the most effective things you can do is to open your mind to what they have to say. If you are welcoming of their ideas, if you hear them and make them feel heard and listened to, they are much more likely to reciprocate and to lower their temperature and hear you out and hear, all right, well, what is it that you have to offer? There are keys to the language that we can use in going beyond, if I ruled the world, this is the thing that I would do, or this is wrong, this is evil. Moving beyond that, moving towards a more policy focus, not just because it's more practical, but because once you get to that policy focus, once you get to that collaborative problem solving stage, suddenly you can bounce ideas back and forth in a way that is much more productive, much more constructive, and much more effective. And that is, again, that common ground from the ground up. And I talk about common ground. A lot of people think of common ground as the things we agree on. For me, the more important common ground is our ability to deal with everything else. It is that common language. It is that common idea of we are working towards a better future. We are working towards better solutions. We are working to resolve these problems that we are facing, even if we see different pieces of the problems, even if we see different problems within the problem. Having that as a commonality is far more valuable because we are going to have things we disagree on. Now, maybe more than ever, because these political movements have developed for so long in isolation from one another, because we have so many voices now that are expressing sometimes fringe beliefs that weren't being heard before are more in the conversation. And you know what? I think they deserve a place too. And I think it's worth hearing them out, making them feel heard, and making a conversation where, yeah, we can share ideas and we can still feel like, even if we don't agree, okay, we're learning from each other. We're all working together towards something positive.
One of the slogans that has kind of took off with my show is, no left, no right, just forward. In your opinion, how does that slogan kind of apply to, what, how you look at things?
So we actually had a forward, we used not left, not right forward for some years. So I think, and we weren't the first, I think No Labels had a version of it that predates that. So it's been around in different forms. It's a great slogan. It's, I think, speaking very much to those of us who have felt politically homeless and who felt frustrated by this sort of team mentality of, let's just find, what is the Democrat way? What is the Republican way? That's not a solution. But I think something to be cognizant of, and something that I think is worth acknowledging, is the ideas that are ultimately going to be effective policy. They might come from the left. They might come from the right. They might be something where historians are going to argue of, does this represent conservative thought or liberal thought, or where do we place it on this four-dimensional spectrum that they're going to have in the future to understand politics? But it's not because of that a solution is good or working. It's because it works, because it is effective, because it solves the problem at hand. And that's the core of, I think, the ethos that we need to have, because you can't go into a conversation saying, I know your side is wrong, or look, you can have your opinion, but the real answer is going to be in the center. Not necessarily. I think people should have that freedom to enter the conversation, add their ideas, and regardless of where these ideas are coming from, who these ideas are coming from, if they are good ideas, they deserve to be heard. And we deserve to hear them, because we do have problems that deeply need to be solved.
Yeah, no, I mean, we definitely do. Is there anything that you know of that's going on from your perspective that gives you hope for the future?
I know just how many people are out there trying to make something that works, trying to forge a different kind of thinking. And some have really exciting ideas. If you want something on a more policy level, something I've been passionate about for a while is exploring more service programming. And this is the kind of classic volunteer AmeriCorps style teaching, counseling, mentoring, nursing, sometimes, as a way of getting, I think, youth who are more and more alienated, and especially in this technology age, who feel disconnected at times, giving them a sense of purpose and direction, from the standpoint also of building an economy that is more resilient against automation and the rise in AI in various fields, and having something that is more people centered. That is an example of an idea that I point to, that is just, it's not polarizing, it's not offensive enough to get the parties to talk about it. And I hope it's not polarized. I hope it's not just trademarked by one party or the other, because it's one of these many ideas where there's a lot of things we can be looking at to improve our society, improve mental health, improve our sense of connectedness to one another, to address these economic crises that we're facing, housing, this and that. There's a lot out there. There's a lot of ideas out there, and a lot of them aren't being heard. And I think there's more demand for people to hear those.
Yeah. You know, I really appreciate you coming on, Nathan.
I
You know,
appreciate you having me.
everybody, don't forget to check out his book, Common Ground from the Ground Up. And especially if you listen to this show, to me, it kind of seems like a no-brainer that you'd pick that up. The link will be down in the description. And if you want some balanced voices and real talk, hit subscribe to our to our podcast. On Apple and Spotify. Seems to be where we get a ton of traction. And if you're picking up his book, get some middle ground coffee at the website. No left, no right, no forward. Hope everyone has a good time.